Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, No Influencers Here, How to Get Free Media Coverage for Your Restaurant, presented by Taryn Scheer, owner of TK Public Relations. I'm Patricia Capella, Conference Manager for the Clarion UX Food Shows, which produces several industry shows, including last month's International Restaurant and Food Service Show in New York, and our upcoming Western Food Service and Hospitality Expo in LA in August, and the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Show in Orlando in September. We do invite you to visit www.foodandbevshows.com for more information on all of our upcoming events. A few housekeeping notes before Taryn begins the presentation. All audience members are on listen-only mode, which means you are muted. We will be monitoring audience engagement on the dashboard and encourage you to participate by using the question pane. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the session. This webinar, as well as others in our series, will be made available on our website in the coming week. Now, without further ado, let me turn the program over to Taryn Scheer. Taryn.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot of great information to go through, and by the end of this, I want you to feel confident in reaching out to your local media contacts and landing some major stories for your restaurant. So let's dive in. First and foremost, just a little bit about us so you know why I have the expertise to speak to you today. Our firm specializes in earned media coverage. Okay, so we go after the national titles like the Oprah magazine, like Travel and Leisure, like Bon Appetit, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and we try to land the stories that you're reading or the features that you're seeing on television. We are not paying for commercials. We are not paying for ads, but we're trying to get stories told, and we've done this successfully with thousands and thousands of placements over the years. And today we're going to share with you the insights of how we do exactly that. I'm not going to hold anything back. I'm literally going to give you all of the secrets to what we do. And so the biggest topic that I get asked about in today's world is, what about influencers? And influencers are probably reaching out to you on a regular basis at this point. They're everywhere. They're coming from all over. They might be visiting your city and see your restaurant and reaching out to you and asking for a free meal in exchange for some coverage. I'm not telling you not to engage with influencers. That's up to you, and that's a totally separate topic for a different day. But what I will tell you is influencers are usually looking for a payday. They're looking for anywhere from $250 to $1,200 for a single photo to run on Instagram. So again, to each his own. If you have a budget carved out aside for that, that's great. But today what I want to talk to you about is what we call traditional public relations. That's free coverage, or what I call earned media, in the newspapers and the magazines, on the television, the radio, and online. So we're going to go through this very quickly. By all means, if you have questions, feel free to submit them, and at the end, I'll try to address as many of them as we possibly can. But here's how we're going to do this today. We're going to do a brief 5 W's, your basic who, what, when, where, why from 5th grade. Then we're going to go into exactly how to do this, and then a few specific examples. So, first and foremost, when should you try and get PR? The overall answer here is all the time. Okay, I see so many restaurants that wait for PR until after they really needed it. Okay, the first thing being, if you're growing or you have a new opening, you're opening a new concept, don't wait until you're already open to figure it out, right? But that's certainly a reason to be getting new PR. If you have changes in your business, if you bring in a new chef that's got, a local following or a regional following or even a national following, that's a great reason to go after some PR. If there's something going on in your restaurant on a seasonal basis, or you change your menu seasonally, or you're having a major anniversary or something that's going on that's very timely, the answer here is just because. You always want to be going after PR. So when is really 365 days a year. The other when here is, when are you going to see results? Because that's what people want to know. We live in a world where you want instant gratification. But the reality of earned media coverage that we're talking about today is it takes time, okay? You might get successful and pitch a story to a journalist that features an online publication. They might have a faster turnaround. You might see something in a week. You might see even something even sooner. But I've worked on stories with chefs that have literally taken years to come to fruition. So this is a long game. This is not a quick fix. This is not we're in the red, we need a fast something to help us bump up and get back on track. This is not going to do that, okay? This is a long-term strategy, and hopefully you're in this for the long haul. So you need to be thinking in that regard too when you're working with journalists and not expecting an immediate return. Okay. Ultimately, again, why do you want this? You want this for exposure. You don't necessarily need to think about this as, or I'm hoping that this is going to bring in 300 customers tomorrow. It might, but you can't think of PR in that way, okay? There's no way to know for sure sometimes if something that you had land in Food and Wine magazine drives a customer into your business tomorrow or 6 months from now, okay? It's all about raising awareness for your overall brand. It's about building a constant hype for your brand. And so I often suggest to people, if you need something fast, you might want to go the social media route. You might want to go the advertising route because you might never be able to track what PR is actually doing for your business. So let's go into exactly how to increase your odds of getting media coverage. This is the meat of what we want to talk about here today. First and foremost, you need to be prepared. What does that mean? You don't want to start reaching out to a journalist before you have a few things ready to go. Okay, journalists are working on tight deadlines. Okay, so if they respond to your email, they're going to want information immediately. First and foremost, you need to have a website. I understand if you're getting ready to open a new restaurant and you might not have a fully developed website yet, or you might not want to put out your menu yet, but you need to have somewhere that journalists can go. Number one, because they need to see that you're legitimate. But number two, if they're going to run a story about your business, how are you going to capture those customers that read that story and are interested in learning more? So if nothing else, you want to have a landing page that people who are reading the articles can go to and submit their information for more information when you're getting ready to open. Your website, if you are already an established business, should be up to date and current. A journalist doesn't want to go to your website and see, a menu that hasn't been updated since 2013. They don't want to see information about a chef that everybody in your area knows left and moved on 2 years ago. You've got to keep your website up to date and current. We're all going to websites to look at restaurant menus, and you want to have that information up to date. The first place a journalist is going to go is to your website. So if you are thinking about redoing your website, don't start reaching out to journalists until you do that. Oftentimes you get one chance with a journalist, and I will tell you from experience, many journalists that will wind up writing about your restaurant never even set foot in your restaurant. It's a reality. I know, some people can't wrap their head around that, but oftentimes your restaurant can get featured in a national news story, and that journalist that wrote the story never set foot in your restaurant. They went to your website, they looked at the photos, they looked at the menu, and they decided they liked what they saw, so they included you in the story. So the website needs to be a virtual postcard for your brick and mortar. You want to have the bios of your key personalities ready to go. Like I mentioned, you might be pitching Beat Bobby Flay or a show on the Food Network, and they come back to you and say, yeah, we want to hear more about your chef. Can you send us a bio? Okay, well, if they're interested, it's one of those strike while the iron is hot. You don't have to run back to your chef who's on his off day and doesn't answer his phone and say, I need a bio. Can you get me something together? And then you don't have anybody who can write it. You have to have that bio that's ready to send immediately when you get that, yes, I want more information response. So have the bios ready to go. It might be a bio of your sommelier. It might be your general manager, the owner, whoever it may be. But the key personalities, the people who are going to be interacting and engaging with the media, are the bios that you need ready to go. You need to have phenomenal photography. Again, as I mentioned, many journalists might not ever set foot in your establishment, and they might still include you in a story. And the deciding factor of whether or not they will include your restaurant or your dishes in a story as opposed to somebody else's is going to come down to the photography. And often it's the food photography. Food photography is the most important thing that you can spend money on the front end to give to journalists. And this it doesn't have to be every item on your menu. It can be your signatures. It could be a couple of seasonal dishes if you change your menu regularly, but they need to be beautiful, styled food shots. You should hire a food stylist or a food photographer who knows what they're doing, not just your sister's best friend because she owns a really nice camera. So invest in the photography on the front end because, again, it will pay dividends on the back end and lead to stories that you wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Have recipes available. When you think about all of the online stories and even the print magazine features, they all want to see recipes, okay? So have, again, 4 or 5 of the dishes that you're going to photograph, have the written down recipes for that, and make sure they're not in restaurant quantities, right? You want to have them for a serving of 4 to 8 people at the most. But have those, again, ready to go. If you're going to pitch, a Cinco de Mayo roundup because you have a taqueria and you're going to pitch them your signature taco, well, I guarantee you a journalist is going to respond and say, that sounds great. Can you send me the recipe? You don't want to then again have to run back to your chef and hunt them down and get the information and then reduce quantities, have it ready to go before you pitch it. Be willing to offer freebies. So what does this mean? It means that you're willing to host people in your restaurant for free, not the general public, but journalists. A lot of times our local media are on heavy budgets and they don't have the ability to go out every night to a nice restaurant. But if you invite them to come in and do a tasting, chances are they're going to wind up featuring you in some capacity and write about you. But you're willing to roll out the red carpet for them, offer them to come in and have a nice dining experience with you. And we'll go into down the line how to do this, whether it's a group event or an individual event, but you have to be willing to offer them a complimentary meal and have a digital media kit. And so what is a digital media kit? It's a lot of the components that we just talked about, but it's all in one document ready to go. It's kind of the digital version of a brochure, right? Your restaurant doesn't necessarily have a brochure that you're handing out, but you have all of this information readily available for the media in a document that you can just send off. You save it as a PDF. That's the most universally easy way to send a file. It's not sending them 12 different attachments that they're afraid to open. And you're not going to send this unless a journalist asks. But that way there, if a journalist asks for more information and they want to know, some of the accolades that you've gotten, some of the awards that you got, this is your chance to shine. This is your chance to put your restaurant right in front of them and say, this is why you should feature us. This is what we do. And make sure you put contact information in there. I can't tell you how many times I get a digital media kit and there is no contact information. So a lot of these journalists will file this information into a folder. And like I said, maybe you reached out to them in January about your tacos and they were thinking, okay, well, it's not relevant right now, but they might be planning a Cinco de Mayo story. They might think to themselves, I received some information about a taco guy. Where is that? They're going to open up the file. And if they can't find contact information, they're going to go on to the next file of the person who did send them easy to find contact information. So make sure you include that as well. Pick a spokesperson. Listen, in our industry, this is easy, right? This is chances are it's your chef. But some of our chefs have big personalities, and some of them have sharp tongues. So you have to really think through this one and be confident in your chef and your personality. And I know a lot of restaurants that have had experiences where they're not confident in their chef and knowing what they're going to be able to say on camera or in an interview. And in that case, you've got to find somebody else who can represent your restaurant, but you have to know that that person might not be appropriate to then go on television for a cooking segment. So you pick a spokesperson for your restaurant. Ideally, it's somebody that's visible in the restaurant. People come to restaurants in today's world to see the local celebrity, to see the person that they saw on television or the person that was quoted in the magazine. And it's great when it can be your chef, I'll be honest, but sometimes that means it should be your sommelier. Sometimes it is the general manager, but find somebody who has the authority to speak on behalf of the restaurant and the confidence to speak on behalf of the restaurant, that they don't need to get approvals from somebody higher up, that they can go on at a moment's notice, and that they speak very clearly. They have a great personality. Personality is key here as well. And that they're the type of person that you would want to invite into your home. Think about when you turn on the TV and you're watching a great chef cook on television, that you feel like you've invited them into your living room, invited them into your kitchen. You want whoever you decide is your personality representing your restaurant to feel that same way. Know who you are pitching. So here's a big thing. Just because you know somebody in the newsroom or you know somebody at the local magazine doesn't mean it's the right person. The most common mistake that I find people make is they reach out to somebody that they know that works for a magazine or one of the TV outlets, and they're a salesperson. If they have the title account executive, they're going to try to sell you something. So you want to make sure you're finding the right person at the magazines, the newspapers, the TV stations, whatever it may be. And the easiest way to do this is to read the magazine or read the website or watch the TV broadcast. Okay, it's the simplest way to figure out if you're going to the right person. The same person that produces the food segments for the Today Show produces them every single week. So going to the hard news producer is not the right person behind that. The person who writes your local food column in your local newspaper is always the person that's writing the food column, chances are. Again, it's not the breaking news person that's writing that. And so if you reach out to the person who covers local government, that email is going to die in their inbox. But if you go to the right person At least you've started yourself halfway there. You've still got to work on your pitch, but at least you're pitching the right person. Once you've found that right person, be persistent, okay? It's constantly an uphill battle in this industry. Just because you pitch a journalist one time and don't get a response doesn't mean your game is over. I have taken a personal philosophy of silence is not a no, and it's not a no until it's a no. These journalists are getting inundated with emails. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of emails every single day. And so you've got to make yours stand out. And sometimes that just means reaching out over and over again to the same person until finally you catch them on the right day at the right time. And there's no methodology. There's no universal answer for how that works, right? One journalist might always have a meeting every Tuesday at 2 that you don't know exists, while another one might always have a meeting every Wednesday at 11 a.m. And so you've got to try to send emails to journalists at different times, different days, and you've got to follow up. You know, the thing about persistence is not just sending an email, crossing your fingers, closing your eyes, and hoping that it lands on their desk. It's following up with them. And that doesn't mean calling them 10 minutes later and saying, hey, did you get my email? But persistence means a constant, slow movement, slowly pushing that ball up the hill. And so, you might send an email to a journalist on a Monday, let's say. You hear nothing back. 6, 7, 8 days later, as long as it's not something that's super time sensitive, that's a great time to follow up. If you hear nothing back again, maybe let it go for a couple weeks. As long as you're sure that it's the right journalist that you're reaching out to and that's the person that you're trying to get to, then come up with a new approach. Change your pitch to that journalist just a little bit and try them again in a few weeks and try them again in a few weeks. And I promise you, over time, as long as you didn't get the no, stop bothering me, eventually you'll crack the nut. Now, here's the big thing. When the nut finally cracks, you've got to be available. So I have sent emails that have gone unresponded to literally for 2 years, and then one morning I'll wake up and have a response from a journalist that's responding to an email from 2 years ago saying, are you still working with such and such? And I immediately respond to that, right? You don't know when a journalist is going to call, but when they do, you've got 5 minutes to call them back. You don't have 5 days to call them back. You don't have 3 days to call them back. Journalists, when they finally do reach out to you, are reaching out because they're working on the story right then and right there, and you had sent them something at some point that was interesting to them. Okay, I've seen so many stories that are lost because your front desk manager will take the phone call because there was no contact information provided, and that person will pass it off to the manager on duty, and eventually that Post-it note will make its way to the main office desk. By the time that Post-it note gets where it needed to be, the story was long gone. And so an important key here is training your staff to know that if a journalist or somebody who sounds like they're calling from either the TV station or a paper or a magazine calls, that note needs to be passed along immediately. That is like a piece of paper on fire that needs to make its way all the way to the top. You have to be available and you have to be ready. And I'll give you an example of this later on, but when a journalist calls and says, we want you, can you do it? You don't really get to say no. Okay, you only get a very limited window with these folks to build trust, and they expect that the world revolves around them and their news outlet. So if they say, hey, we really want to include you, but I'm on deadline and I need this, by 2 p.m. tomorrow, you've got to move mountains to get it done by 2 p.m. tomorrow. Okay. Position yourself as an industry expert and a leader. Okay, so this is kind of a no-brainer. We all know who these guys are, but think about yourself on a local scale, okay? You know what's going on in the food world. Chances are you attend conferences or you're aware of the industry trends. You read up on all the magazines. There's a great way to make yourself a leader in your community and beyond. There are conferences that happen on statewide levels in the restaurant industry that you can start attending and eventually working your way up to being a speaker at. But there's also a great opportunity for you to be known as an expert in your own community. And that starts to develop credibility for you. And with credibility becomes notoriety. And with notoriety, now the media is calling. They're paying more attention to you. The whole goal with PR is that you become a regular in the media. It's not just landing a story one time, but it's being in multiple stories over time so that people keep saying the name of your restaurant, the name of your chef, the name of your owner over and over again, so that locally it becomes somewhat of a household name. So that when people are thinking on a Friday night, where do we want to go out to eat? They think of you because they read about you in the newspaper, because they saw you on TV. That's the point of all of this. And so an easy thing to do to be generating news coverage year round is to be known as an expert. And when you're known as an expert, you have to sometimes take yourself outside of the box. It's not always just pitching your restaurant specifically and what you're doing, but it's talking about trends on a larger scale and what's going on in the industry and around you. And that's how you really become a trusted expert. And again, somebody that journalists will rely on. And if you build that relationship with a journalist, that you become their go-to expert, when you need something and you have a story to tell about your restaurant, they're going to take your phone call. And ultimately, that's what you want. So by that token, you need to pay attention to the news and the trends and what's going on. And I know many of you are going to be buried in your day-to-day and running the operations of your business, and you don't have time to worry about one more thing, but you've got to know what's going on outside your four walls, because that's how you can really capitalize on media opportunities. Paying attention to, whatever the next big trend is or what's happening in the news cycle, that's going to help you develop story ideas that you're pitching to journalists, okay? Whether or not it's, Super Bowl snacks or the eclipse is coming through your town, and here are the 5 restaurants to make sure you don't miss if you're in the path of the eclipse this year. Whatever the trends are that are happening, you can position a story around that, because many times the stories that we read about in the Wall Street Journal, for example, the New York Times, some of the larger publications are not just about one particular restaurant, but they're about a larger trend. And they talk about 3 or 4 or 5 different restaurants. You can be in those stories just as easily as the next person. You just have to be paying attention to them to know what to be pitching to journalists. Okay, thinking bigger picture and thinking smaller picture. So there's 2 ways to go here, and ultimately it's just about thinking outside the box. So one way of approaching this is there one employee in your business that has a remarkable story? Is there one truly exceptional person that's overcome obstacles and is just busting their rear end and has, maybe he hasn't taken a sick day in 30 years and he's got a great family story. Maybe it's that person. Maybe it's that person that you want to shine a spotlight on, that they're doing something truly great. Again, this isn't now about what's on your menu. This isn't about, the most recent award that you've done. This is a humanitarian piece. People love good humanitarian stories. And so finding that smaller picture story, that's oftentimes what will capture the national media's attention. On that same token, thinking bigger picture. So looking for those trend pieces, looking for what's happening on a larger scale that you're a part of. What are some of the movements that are happening, the bigger stories that are happening on a national scale that you think our business is doing something just like that? And how can you piggyback on some of those larger trends? Okay, invite people to your restaurant to experience it firsthand. Now, this is twofold. Number one, you've got your local media. What better way for your local media, if they haven't been in your restaurant in a long time, than to invite them to come to your restaurant for a special media event? The other way is, if you want to attract national media attention, you want to invite them to come to your restaurant and experience it firsthand. Some might take you up on it, some may not, but you have to be prepared for those that take you up on that offer. That means you're flying them in. That means you're putting them up. This is a much bigger expense, right? I mean, the reality of the world that we live in is that the major titles in today's world don't have the budgets to be sending their writers all over the world anymore. So if there's a food critic that you've had your eye on, or a food writer that you've been wanting to attract for a long time, then you might think to yourself, okay, for 2020, we're going to plan and pad a little bit of a budget so that we could attract some national media attention and offer to bring some of these folks in. Okay. You might also look at partnering with your local convention and visitors bureau. If you have a tourism organization, that is your single best friend in your market, because they probably have a little bit more of a budget than you do to be bringing tourists into your market. They're probably doing it already. And so get to know whoever is handling your local tourism PR efforts, and make sure they're aware of your restaurant and they're aware of what you're doing, and tell them that you are always willing to host journalists for free. Again, like we talked about, give them a complimentary meal, but let them know that you'd be happy to help them out if they're hosting journalists in your market. That way their people can experience your restaurant firsthand. And again, like I said, some journalists might not take you up on it, but at least it puts you on their radar again, and it just gives you that additional foot in the door with these people to say, hi, I'm here, this is what we're doing, and if you're ever in town, we'd love to host you for a meal. So sometimes you can't bring them to you, but what if you could bring your restaurant to them? Okay, there are a number of ways to do this, but essentially you pack your bags, you take your chefs, and you find somewhere where you can either do a restaurant takeover, maybe you try to do a dinner at the James Beard House in New York. Maybe you have a friend in another city that's a target market. Maybe it's within a 3-hour, 4-hour drive to radius of you, which is a great weekend destination market. And, you could say to your friend, hey, I know you've got your restaurant and you're closed on Mondays. Would it be okay if we came in and took over your restaurant on a Monday night and hosted a little event there? And it's a media event, and maybe they can invite some of their VIPs as well. But essentially, you're bringing your restaurant and your flavors to them, making it almost impossible for them to say no, because now you're literally in their backyard. So how to pitch a journalist. This is the big part here, because all of this means you've got to make contact with the journalist. So first and foremost, and this is an older report, but I assure you that if anything, the numbers have just gone up. Everybody wants to get an email. Nobody wants to get a cold call. Journalists do not want you to call them and start pitching them on the phone. I know a number of journalists that keep their voicemail boxes always full, and every call goes to voicemail. So you can't even leave them a message, and it's done very intentionally so. So that means you're emailing a journalist. So you've got one chance to send off the best pitch that you've ever created. So what do? You do not send anything that says for immediate release. Unless Mark Zuckerberg came to your restaurant and said, I want to buy it and I want to, take over the entire city here because of your restaurant, please don't send anything that says for immediate release. Okay, we are in the restaurant industry. The majority of what we do falls into the lifestyle category here. And so nothing that we're doing is breaking news or anything that's truly going to shake up the industry as a whole. And so you don't need to send something that says for immediate release. Okay, what you do want to do is send a general pitch. So it's the same information that would have gone into a press release. The idea of a press release dates back to like the 60s, 70s, 80s PR. The idea of the content is okay. It's your basic, back to your 5th grade, who, what, when, where, why. Bottom line, what are you trying to tell me? But the difference between the press release and the pitch is shaping a story for them. Okay, so think about when you read a story in Food and Wine, or you read a story even in your local paper under the food section. How are they featuring that story? They are not printing a press release, I can tell you that for sure. Okay, so how are they writing a story? You need to think in terms of that when you pitch the journalist. You need to think like a journalist. How would this story read if I were to read my own story in print? And that's how you pitch the journalist. So you might be pitching to a specific column that you're very familiar with how the layout works, or you might be just pitching an overall trend like we talked about, something that's happening in the industry or that's happening from a timeliness factor. That's how you open your email to a journalist. That's how you pitch a journalist. You pitch an idea. Okay, you're not pitching your restaurant as the pitch. That will come after. The pitch is the idea. It's the overall concept. It's the, why do I care about this right now? Why is this email relevant to me today? That's your pitch. Then you can tell them a little bit about your restaurant or the necessary who, what, when, where, why. Do not give them a standard quote. Do not give them a quote that came from the CEO or the owner that took 4 rounds of approvals to get. And here's why. In today's world, everybody is in competition. Nobody wants to have the same quote as the other competing local newspaper. If they want a quote, they're going to call you and ask you for a quote, and they want a different quote than what another paper might get. So there's no point. You are literally just wasting time in getting those quotes put together. Nobody is going to use them in today's world. A few other don'ts before we go into a few do's. Keep this short. Do not send paragraphs of information, okay? Think about when you read an email on your phone, because many of these journalists are running from breakfast to lunch to another meeting, and they're catching up on emails on their phone. When you open an email on your phone that's more than 6 sentences, it looks like the printed dictionary. It looks like it goes on forever, and it's just a headache. That's exhausting, and it's almost always immediately deleted. Okay, you've got to keep this short. You've got to keep it tight. You've got to get to the point immediately, and here's why. If they want more information, they will ask for it immediately. If they are intrigued by the pitch that you sent and the information that you sent, they are going to request more information. And when they do, that's your opportunity to flood them with all the information that you want. That's when you can send them that PDF, that media kit that we talked about early on with the bios and the photos and the accolades. All that information comes later. It does not come in your intro email, okay? Do not send the same email to 30 different contacts. Do not send the same email to 60 different contacts, okay? In today's world, it's so very apparent when somebody has done the spray and pray method, and that means you literally shoot out this email to as many people's email addresses you can find, you cross your fingers, and you hope that someone is just dumb enough not to realize that it went out to everybody else on your mailing list, okay? You have to take a very targeted approach. And even if it means sending an individual email that has essentially the same content to 3 different people, that's okay. But it's an individually drafted email that's a separate email for each of those 3 people. Okay, as I mentioned, do not call a journalist and ask if they got their email. A follow-up is great. A follow-up is fine, but do not call them to follow up. Email follow-up is the best way to do it. I have a rule of thumb that unless a journalist calls me and kind of opens that door for communication, then we are sticking to email. Many of the journalists that you're going to be reaching out to, I hate to tell you, are in their 20s and do not want to have a phone conversation with you. They avoid the phone like the plague. And you know, you'll know right away when you start getting the phone calls. Oftentimes it's a little bit more of the seasoned old school journalists, but a lot of times you're dealing with the younger journalists and they do not like the phone. It's just a reality. They just don't. So stick to email. Okay? A giant red flag to a journalist is if you ask to see a story before it runs. Okay? Don't do that. It's just very amateur. It makes you look really silly. 99% of journalists are not going to send you the story before it runs. Every once in a while, there's a unicorn and you will get to see it. That is not an opportunity to take a red pen to the story, but it is an opportunity to look for any major corrections. But I will tell you, for the most part, you don't get to see the story. You've got to be sure that what you are communicating is clear and understandable and that you're giving them the proper information. Now, I will tell you that mistakes happen and stories run with errors or stories run with the wrong web link or things of that nature. This is a time to pick your battles. If you want to have a relationship with that journalist and you want them to feature you again, you know, if they say that your chef was from Boston and he's actually from Chicago originally, does anyone care other than the chef and his parents? Probably not. Okay, so if it's not a deal breaker, don't pick your battle with that one. You want to have a relationship with the journalist that they want to work with you again. They do not want to work with people that nitpick over things. Now, if they completely butchered the name of your restaurant or your website is wrong or something that really would impact your business in generating any kind of ROI from the article that ran, then absolutely you can reach out to the journalist. But again, keep in mind, if it's a story that ran in print in the New York Times, in today's world, a redaction doesn't do very much anyway. And remember, don't ask a journalist to pay their own way. They do not have the budgets to do that. I will tell you, true food critics will pay their own way, hands down. There are only a handful of true food critics left in today's world that will insist on paying their own way. But if somebody does not insist, it does not mean that you should present them with a check. A few do's, because I think ending on a positive in this regard is always important. Do read the outlets that you're pitching. You have to know the content for the magazines that you're pitching. If you haven't read the local Palette magazine and you're not familiar with the type of content that they feature, then why are you pitching them? Just because you know that they're a food publication doesn't mean that you've got the right story to pitch them. You've got to be familiar with the outlets that you're pitching. Okay, we talked about sending a follow-up. Absolutely. Here's a tough one that oftentimes I find people have a hard time with. Not everything you're doing is newsworthy, okay? If you're doing a, $2 Taco Tuesday promotion, that's not necessarily newsworthy, okay? That's a great marketing tool. That's great for your social media pages, not necessarily newsworthy, okay? But, you might be able to spin that as far as, like we talked about, offer a recipe, and maybe they could mention at the bottom of the story, hey, by the way, such and such restaurant is now offering Taco Tuesdays. okay? And if a journalist reached out to you and says, hey, we want to include you in this, we're going to need all the information by 5 p.m. at Friday, why don't you go ahead and send them everything they need by 2 p.m. on Friday? Because I will tell you what, even though they said 5 o'clock, by 4 o'clock, they're going to be emailing you and asking where everything is. So you always want to over-deliver, and you never want to make a journalist wait until the very end of their deadline for information, okay? You want, again, to build trust with journalists so that they want to work with you. And if you're always giving them what they need ahead of the deadline, they're going to want to work with you again. The last piece of this before we go into a few examples is do something with it, okay? If a tree falls and nobody hears it, so what? So I have so many people that come and say, yeah, we've landed on all these top 10 lists. We've gotten all these, great media mentions. And I say, so what have you done with them? Well, nothing. Shout it from the rooftops, okay? The best businesses that I have worked with are the ones that recycle every story that we get for them, and they take it and they do multiple things with it. They don't just put it on their social media, on their Facebook page today, but they'll take out quotes and have them live on their website forever, and they'll attribute them to the news outlet that featured them. That's instant credibility. They'll use it in their marketing materials that are right in their restaurant. If they have postcards in their table takeaways, they'll put it right out there. They'll put it as ads. They'll take out direct quotes and use that in their advertising if they're advertising as well. What's more credibility than someone from Travel and Leisure saying it was one of the top 10 restaurants they visited all year? So don't just let these media stories die. We live in a news cycle where you land a story and 2 days later everybody's forgotten about it. But it's up to you internally to make sure this media coverage lives on. Make sure your employees know about it at the very least. And be proud of these stories that you're landing. I mean, this is third-party endorsement. This is not, your employees saying we have the best meatloaf in town. This is a journalist who travels the world saying this is one of the best meatloafs I've ever eaten. So make sure you keep using those stories, and I will tell you what, these are evergreen. As long as you have that meatloaf on your menu, you can keep riding that best meatloaf accolade as long as you want. So much of today's content is recycled. I'm often surprised, but not really, when I'll click on a food and wine link that's the best French fries in America and realize it's back from 2014. The content hasn't been updated, but I still clicked on it and I'm still reading through it. But most consumers don't even realize that it's a really old story. And the same thing goes with any of the press mentions that you get. Just because it was 5 years ago that you were named, the best, seafood bisque on the East Coast, by all means, you can ride that wave as long as you want for the next 10 years, as long as you keep it current in all of your marketing materials. So I want to talk a little bit about a few specific examples, and then I'll open it up to questions. But I just kind of want you guys to put this into perspective for your own businesses. So the first thing is, go after a specific column. This is what we do all the time. When I mentioned, we're not pitching 30 journalists at the same time, it's because we're going after the one journalist that writes one particular column. So Wine Spectator, for example, has a column called The Perfect Match. And it's a really easy formula to follow because every issue, they feature the same method. It's the same, a little bit of background about the restaurant, a little bit about the chef, and it's the dish with the perfect match. And it's the perfect pairing, okay? So when we develop the pitch for this, we develop it exactly as it would appear in the magazine. Here's the chef we're pitching. Here's a little bit about the restaurant. Here's the dish. Here's the wine pairing. That's it. We're catering it exactly to the way that we know that they're going to write the column. It makes the journalist's job easy. It shows that you're reading the outlet, you're paying attention, okay? The same thing goes for television, okay? There are only a handful of TV segments in our industry that lend themselves to chefs and to restaurateurs, okay? So figuring out exactly how that content is done. CBS This Morning every Saturday has a segment called The Dish. It's the same every weekend. I have watched enough segments to know that the questions that they ask are almost exactly the same, or at least the path that they take through the career of the chef that they're featuring is exactly the same every week, and they always end on the same question. Okay, so if you're going to pitch for that, you pitch it exactly the way that it would appear on television. Pitch for that specific segment, the specific column, and the journalist who's behind it. Pitch a personality. So a lot of the columns that you see in some of the more lifestyle magazines, even though they're food-oriented, aren't food-forward. So pitching a chef and what he likes to do on his days off is oftentimes a great way to land a story. So we worked with a chef that loves to cycle. He actually moved to his current city because of the cycling amenities there. And so we knew that would be a great fit for Men's Journal in a column that they specifically do where they feature chefs. It's their food and drink column, but they don't just feature recipes. They don't just talk all about the chef and their restaurant. They talk about them as a person because we all have personalities behind what we're doing as well. I touched on this very, very briefly at the beginning, but if you're getting ready to open a new restaurant, don't wait until the news has already happened to announce it. So we worked on a restaurant opening recently, and these are the titles that we were in before the restaurant ever even opened their doors. Okay, you want to drum up buzz for your restaurant before you're opening, especially if you're opening with a chef that's got a little bit of background in the industry, that's got a buzz, that's got some interesting accolades wherever he was before that. But start drumming up the press long before your doors ever open. And oftentimes that means, when you're about 6 months out and you already kind of have things falling into place, that's when you want to start reaching out. Because again, some of the longer lead titles are going to take 6 months to come to fruition. So you don't want to be late to the party when your doors are finally open. Pay attention to the trends that are going on, and how you can get some of your personalities, whether it's your chef or your mixologist, into a trend story. So a great example of an opening that played into a trend story, we had a juicery that was opening, and we went to Food and Wine, and we met with them, and we chatted with them, and they said, well, we don't really spotlight, restaurant openings unless they're tied to a big name or a big name city or celebrity, but we'd be interested in featuring your chef if they could talk about the trend itself and something that's a little bit more unique. So we were able to get the restaurant featured in light of its opening with Food and Wine by being part of a trend story. So figure out how you could be part of a trend story and pitch for those. Paying attention to what's happening in the news right now. And so this is a little bit of an older example, but it's a perfect example of what happened. The minute we found out who was playing in Super Bowl 50, we knew that one of our restaurants had a dish called the Ham Newton. Okay, so we immediately started reaching out to our food contacts and said, we know the Panthers are going to Super Bowl 50. We have a restaurant that has a sandwich called the Ham Newton. You've got to feature it. And sure enough, when they did a roundup of the best Super Bowl themed bites from around the country, we were the first one that they included. We jumped on it the minute we found out that they were going to the Super Bowl. And so pay attention to what's happening in your neck of the woods. And is there something that just so happens? We didn't create that. It just happened to be on our menu and the stars aligned. And so how can you play on that sort of a thing? Be creative to get attention. The best, most well-known example of this is the Cronut. But I want to share this example with you because it's a restaurant group that we work with here. This is what they did for the eclipse. It's, again, the juicery, and they made something called Black Sun Lemonade that used active charcoal. And so it started off, the first one is already, the picture that you see is actually a little bit already shaken, but it started off basically as a yellow drink. And as you shook it, it turned dark. And so it was basically a liquid eclipse. And so we took that, had a blast with it when we had the eclipse here in Greenville, South Carolina 2 years ago. And sure enough, the chef showed up when Fox News was broadcasting live to bring his eclipsing drink to the on-air personality. She wound up loving it so much that they wound up featuring it on air. They showed how the drink literally eclipsed on live television, and it was a home run. So paying attention to what's happening in your news and then creating something that's truly newsworthy can be a really fun way to get some press. As I mentioned, dropping everything when that phone rings. So this was just this past December in the height of your holiday season when everything is going crazy. That Wednesday, I got a phone call from Fox and Friends asking if the chef that we worked with at a healthy food resort was interested in coming on the show. And I said, of course she would love to. And they said, great, how's Saturday? Now, she's based down in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And again, you're in the middle of the holiday season. Nobody's even answering their phones, let alone wanting to get on a plane and show up in New York. And you know what? We said yes. We had to move mountains to get there, and we figured it out. But we had less than 3 days to essentially plan a trip to get our chef down there and go on live television. But we did it because you don't get to say no. When Fox News calls or the Today Show calls or Good Morning America calls, if you say no, that's it. They're not inviting you back again. You literally have to drop everything when they call, even if it means you were supposed to be on vacation that week. As I mentioned, a great pitch can lead to great coverage. This is a secret I'm going to confess to all of you. Earlier this year, there was a story that ran about the world's most romantic restaurants, and it ran on CNN Travel. and we pitched it based on our website, some great photography, and a really just enticing pitch. And we landed on that list, and the reporter was never in our restaurant. So a great pitch truly can lead to magnificent coverage. And I will tell you what happened with this story when we talk about amplification. On a local scale, this was shared everywhere where this restaurant is. This was a big deal for this restaurant to be named in this list. There were only 2 other restaurants in the United States that made this list. And so everywhere locally picked it up. Our local NBC affiliate, our local newspaper, everybody was jumping all over it because it was exciting and it was international news, but the reality was it was just based off of a great pitch. And as I mentioned, amplify the coverage. So here's a great example of one of the companies that we worked with that also sells some packaged goods. But these are 2 screenshots off of their website. So they took 2 of the direct quotes that we had landed them in media coverage, and they put them right on their website. They scroll right on their website when you land on their website. And so those are 2 stories that could have died the day that we landed them. You know, we live in a fast-paced news cycle. You read the article, you move on. It was posted on Facebook, you move on. But now every time you go to their website, you see these stories. They're still living on. So I think that is everything I have for you guys today. I will turn it over. I know there are a few announcements, and I will gladly open it up to some questions.
Wow, thanks so much, Taryn. This was, I was hanging on every word. So terrific presentation. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. And we do have some questions here that I wanted to get started on because there's more that are seem to be coming in. But yeah, thank you for sharing our slide. Just again, to remind everybody for our upcoming shows, we've got our Western Food Service show in LA and our Florida show coming up in Orlando. And you can go to the foodandbevshows.com to get more information. But Taryn, if you want to click back to your slide, sure. Just in case, you know, if anybody wants to copy down your email address to get in touch, we'll keep that up while we go through the questions. So our first question we have here is, do you have specific sources you like to follow every day that aggregate industry news well? Example, email subscription or Facebook group?
I do subscribe to a lot of the different industry pubs. I do get Eat Beats information. I think they are run out of Nation's Restaurant News. I do subscribe actually to their print magazine too. I enjoy getting that. I actually like to hold a magazine, so I get that. I get Plate's online newsletter. Actually, they had a really interesting article just before we all got on this call about social media and food critics. So I recommend if any of you subscribe to Plate online, check out today's newsletter because there were actually some really interesting and relevant stories as far as what we're talking about here today. But, you know, I try to follow on social media a lot of the journalists that I work with. You know, most of them are not posting, like they're not necessarily posting leads for stories on their social media pages. Every once in a while you'll get wind of something. But there is a great tool that we use called Help a Reporter. If you're not on there, I would advise signing up for that. It's free. And so oftentimes you can develop some contacts through that. And one of the things that I really encourage is once you work with a journalist once and you have a positive experience with them, stay on their radar. And that's how you start building out your list, your go-to media database, so to speak, short of purchasing an actual media database, which you can also do. But really just work to finesse the relationships that you have, because ultimately those are going to be what lead you to land story after story. And on that note, you know, think about who you already know. I'll be honest with you, we landed the CBS, the Dish segment, because I realized that somebody that works in our local media market used to work in New York at CBS, and I reached out to her, and I had been pitching them for the better part of 2 years and hadn't gotten any traction. And I went to my local contact and said, did you happen to know this person? Any chance you'd be willing to give them a nudge? And they were dear old friends. She made a phone call, and within 3 minutes, I had a segment booked. So think about who you know, who's connected on your social media outlets, and you never know who somebody might actually have a relationship with or even be related to. I mean, it's a smaller world than we all realize, and that 6 degrees of separation is very, very real.
Great. No, thank you very much. That's very helpful information to know. And the next question we have here, we are a small restaurant and may not be able to afford an outside agency. Who on the staff should be responsible for PR?
That's a great question. I mean, if you have anyone that has an interest in marketing or journalism in general, I mean, I know that's a hard thing to say, but the most important thing is somebody on the staff who can write and communicate very clearly. And it might sound silly, but literally even saying to them, okay, if you have 3 people that you're considering, have them write a pitch. Say, okay, pitch me, if you have a big event coming up, or, give them a writing test and say, okay, the 3 of you submit. I want to see, what you would send to the media. I mean, that's how I got my first job, to be honest with you, was submitting a pitch and saying, here's how I write, hire me. And so there's nothing wrong with doing that. And then just, it should be somebody who's very involved in the day-to-day, knows what's going on. You don't necessarily want it to be a remote employee or anything like that, but it's one of those things that it can become very consuming, and so you don't want to put too much on somebody's plate. But at the same time, if they're thriving in it, that could become their full-time position, which is a great, to have an in-house PR person is terrific. And actually, this Learn How to Sparkle here on our website is a more in-depth version of what we did here today, and that might be a great tool for them.
Thanks. That's good to know. The next question I have here is, how do you get Instagram attention?
So Instagram is a whole different beast. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this, that requires, I honestly believe that requires somebody who's engaging with social media full time, and somebody in the restaurant industry. I think it needs to be somebody who's in-house. It needs to be somebody who's great at photography. And so that lends itself to an entirely separate webinar, one that I am by no means an expert in, but simply because I've been in this industry long enough and worked hand in hand with a lot of other agencies, I can tell you that it requires its own dedicated strategy. And it should not, with all of this, I will tell you, never put your entire strategy in one basket. You can never rely on just advertising, just social media, just PR. You should have a nice balance of all of them in order for it to really be successful, because the jury's still out on social media and whether or not that's converting into actual sales. And, PR, like we talked about, takes a really long time, and advertising is very costly. So if you can find a balance between the 3, that's where you're going to be the most successful.
This is an interesting question. A person is opening a children's playground with a cafe. Do you have a suggestion for that?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think that's kind of a newsworthy, buzzy topic right now. It's definitely not, top 3 in the restaurant industry, but, the whole should kids be at restaurants, it keeps coming up over and over again. And so to kind of ride that wave and get in front of it and say, we are going to be a kid-friendly destination, you can rock that. I mean, there are so many parenting, travel, food blogs that all kind of come into play. Just because you're a parent doesn't mean that you don't love food and you don't go to restaurants anymore. And, sometimes parents can't get a babysitter. It might be nice to be able to take your kids somewhere. So you can get in front of that and be, top 10 most kid-friendly restaurants in America. I see opportunities for those types of stories all the time, or a version of that. And so, do some homework, find out who else is in that space. And I would suggest you find out who else is doing kid-friendly things that's out of your state or out of your region, so that you're not offering up competitors. But if you go to a journalist and say, hey, I know of these 3 or 4 other spots that are doing it, you've already helped them with a story, with a trend, as opposed to saying, hey, journalist, I have an idea, but I need you to go do the research and figure out the other ones. If you can spoon feed them a few other ideas, you're doing the work for them and making their life really easy, and it's a really cool story.
Yeah, no, that's, I'm already interested. So,
me too.
The next question we have, this is with an event. So they're asking, if we have a great event, can we send out video to the news outlets?
I mean, sure, but you've got to ask yourself the question, why do they care? If it's already happened, so what? Did you raise a ton of money for a local organization? If so, okay, maybe. But why do they care? Why are people sitting at home watching their local news that are more worried about whether a tornado is going to hit? Why do they care about the event that you just did that they weren't at? How is that event impacting them in any way? So you've got to make it now. If it's a milestone, if it's a restaurant that's been in business for 20 years, that might make sense. But you've got to sit back and remove yourself from it, where I talked about not everything that you're doing is newsworthy. Like, is that really newsworthy? or is it just kind of patting yourself on the back? And again, if there's something newsworthy about it, then by all means, but you've got to really think that one through.
Thank you. The next question kind of piggybacks a little bit off of the PR question, who handles your PR, but they're asking, how do you make sure that a chef can do a good interview?
I mean, there are services that offer media training, which I highly encourage. You can even sit with them and play reporter, or if you have somebody that's kind of charismatic or likes to play in that role, absolutely, do a little mock interview with them. And certainly, I mean, the reality is the more people do television, the more comfortable they get. But oftentimes, with local news or local television, you get one chance. And if it's a home run, they're going to invite you back. And if it's a flop, then they're not going to invite you back. And so I always encourage people to set up a little camera and just do a trial run. If they're going to cook on live television on your local morning show, then figure out what they're going to cook and, set up a timer knowing that most segments are going to run anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes and time it out and see how they're doing it and what they're doing and watch some other segments to see what was successful, what they did, even things like looking for clear glass bowls. You wouldn't believe how many chefs go on TV with dark bowls and then, they've only got a one camera shot. You can't see what's in them. So it's little things like that to be watching, seeing what other people do that's successful, what's not, and how you can coach your chef appropriately.
Great, that's great information. And actually, the last question that we have, because I see we're getting close to 3 o'clock, is a pretty good question here. It's, how do you find your media contacts?
So, I mean, the reality is I spend the majority of my day on Google. I am looking for, I read the outlets that I'm looking to be in, like those specific columns. That's how I spend the majority of my time. I don't send out 700 emails a day. On a really good day, I might send out 60 or 70, and that means each one of those was very specific. Now, think about your own personal. So on your scale, if you can send out 2 a day, then that's great. And so that means you saw an article and you thought, damn, that could have been us. So why could that have been you? And you reach out to that journalist and you tell them, I saw this article. You can even link to it if you want to. And all I kept thinking was, man, you need to know about our concept in hopes that next time around, we can work with you too. And so looking online is the best way you can do it. I mean, between social media, between LinkedIn and Instagram and a general Google search, you can find a lot of the contacts that you're looking for. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, people think that's like a unicorn. All of their email addresses are printed in their bylines. I mean, it's not hard to find people. You just have to be a little resourceful. I mean, I built the majority of my contacts literally Googling them one by one by one. Now, if you have a bigger budget and you can invest in a database, there is, kind of the gold standard in PR is Cision, but that's going to cost you upwards of $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year. And so most people can't do that. But again, chances are you're not doing this full time. So if you're only looking for a few contacts a day, you can certainly Google them. And worst case scenario, if you absolutely can't find them, you can try to connect with them on social media in a brief, I've got a story idea for you. Would it be okay if I sent you an email, and see if you can get them that way.
Good point. I was curious about that. And 60 to 70 emails a day. Good. That's kudos to you.
That's not a lot. I mean, I know people that are sending hundreds, but I mean, if you can really, again, yeah, this is what I do all day long. I'm a computer nerd.
Well, again, Taryn, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with the audience. This was really valuable information, and I just want to remind everyone again that this will be available on our website. So if you want to listen in again, you have the opportunity to do so, and you will also get a copy emailed to you as well. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, everyone.